Thank you very much, Charmaine. Here we are, nearly a quarter of the way through 2024. You put your hands up if you have not yet had your birthday in 2024. Keep them up for me. Now, I want you to keep your hand up if you just can't wait until your birthday so that you get to tell people you are a year older. Keep them up if you'd love to be 5 years older. Okay. For many of us, we don't really like the idea of getting old, do we? Anybody like the idea of getting older? No, not many of us. Last week, Barry was telling us that we're in dying bodies. And the older we get, the more that our bodies can kind of decay. We start to see grey hairs, we start to see wrinkles. Our joints don't work the way that they used to. Other things can go wrong, senses, or even our minds. We don't like the idea of getting old because underlying that, we're very aware that we are in these dying bodies. This morning, I've got a goal, okay? And I don't think I'm going to get you to go away thinking, I really wish that I was 20 years older. Okay, I'm not going to get you to do that. But what I want to get over to you is this, that the dying bodies that we have are actually just the very things that we need to prepare us for our undying bodies. And that actually, if we have to struggle with our bodies, with being in dying bodies now, it's worth it because there'll be an eternity of being in perfected bodies. Okay, and you can see we are partway through our series about the power of the resurrection, and this week we're looking at broken bodies fixed. And like I say, my goal for you this morning is to go away knowing that the dying body that you're in now is the very body that God has given you and that you need to prepare you for an undying, eternal body. And my hope for you as well is that if you are someone who knows Jesus, that tomorrow when you wake up a day older, you won't just feel a bit depressed about being a day older, but actually you'll know that you are a day closer to that eternity with God. Charmaine read those verses for us. They were written by a man called Poole. He wrote to a church in Corinth in the 1st century AD, and Paul was known for he was a genius. If you read through his letters that he wrote, it's so obvious that the hand of God, that the word of God is there, because they're incredibly articulate, they are incredibly insightful. But he's also known as someone who is sometimes a little bit hard to follow. And I don't know how you felt when we read those verses. Did anybody wonder why we were being told about stars differing from stars at any point? I think this passage can be a little bit tricky to follow. However, this morning, I don't have any more slides, but instead I have for you a special prop. Can anyone tell me what I've got? An apple. Everybody's seen one of these before. Yeah. You don't know what an apple is, right? I'm going to be explaining to you this morning what I call apple theology. Okay? And what I want to put to you is that if you can understand this apple, you'll be able to understand what Paul wrote here. Okay? So, before we really get into the text, I just want to give you a tiny bit of context for it. You'll see my apple again in a minute, don't worry. Let's not last a few minutes. Hands up if you've ever heard of the Sadducees. Anyone ever heard of the Sadducees? Now, good, that's lots. You don't worry if you haven't. The Sadducees, they were famous for not believing something. They were famous for not believing something. Can anybody tell me what the Sadducees didn't believe in? Resurrection, yeah. So they didn't believe in life after death. So last week, Barry told us that you've got this kind of short life that we're in now. Might be 70, 80 years, might be much smaller, might be a bit bigger. And then you've got this eternal, unending life, okay? And the Sadducees, they didn't believe in this life after death. And what we find is that in the church in Corinth, there were some people who had this belief had resurfaced. They may well have been Sadducees that became Christians and then went back to their old ways, or they might not have been. But there were people who were teaching that this life was all there was. And it was troubling the Christians in Corinth. And particularly, there were two questions that these people were asking. They were saying, how are the dead raised? So this is verse 35. And with what kind of body will they come? Now, I don't know about you, but actually I've often had those questions. Have you ever sort of thought to yourself, well, I know someone who was cremated, so they're dust, they've been scattered. How is God going to raise up a body that's been cremated? Or maybe the slightly more fanciful, I don't actually know anyone in this situation, but maybe you know someone who's had their leg eaten by a shark, and now that's part of a shark's body. How's that person going to get raised from the dead? And also, what will those resurrection bodies look like? What will these bodies look like that we have after we're done with these bodies? And actually, I don't know the answer to those questions, and I think they're perfectly reasonable questions. But behind these questions is something different. If you were ever to read the first book of the Bible, and right at the beginning, there's a time in the Garden of Eden that you've probably heard of, where the snake comes in and he starts asking this question. He says, has God really said, ... And behind the question, the snake isn't really asking what God said, because the snake knows what God said. What he's rather doing is he's questioning God's goodness by asking that question. And we'll see that behind these two questions, they're not really asking how are the dead raised. They're not really asking what's the body going to be like. They're actually saying, I don't think God is powerful enough to do this. That's what they're really doing here. They're really questioning God's power. We're going to see that because Paul doesn't actually answer those questions for us, as much as we'd love him to. Rather, he answers the fact that God is able to do it. Okay. So, and that's why he initially starts by saying how foolish. And I do just want to reassure you that if actually your mind has often thought, I don't know how this is going to work, I don't think he's saying that is foolish. I think it's okay to wonder those things. But to wonder whether God is powerful enough, that's what he's saying is foolish. Now, back to my Apple theology. Can anybody tell me any of the amazing design features of this apple? Anyone? Got seeds in it, yeah, brilliant. And what the seeds have potential to be? Apple trees. Okay. So, God has made apples so that you'll be able to grow new apple trees from them. Anything else about the design of the apple? What about the shape? Does that help in any way? This in the hand? Yes, that's true. That's true, yes, very good for eating, isn't it? Also, in terms of growing a new apple tree, though, any ideas on the shape? Circle. Rolls, yeah, brilliant. So, it falls off the tree. If it just stays there, that's not great, is it? There's lots of roots and it's dark because there's a tree. But if it rolls off, brilliant. It might find itself a nice place to grow. And what about all the kind of apple flesh? Isn't that a bit annoying, really? Because you've got a seed in there trying to be a tree and it's just surrounded by this flesh. How does the flesh help? Decays, yeah. So worms come along and eat it and poo it out and make a lovely kind of fertilizer. So eventually the flesh all kind of disappears and you're in a nice spot and you've got this lovely kind of rich soil so the tree can grow. Okay? Now, what we've just done really is to explain most of what Paul says here. Take a look at verse 36. He says, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. So with this apple, the flesh has to die so that the seed can grow into a tree. And really what Paul is saying to them is he's saying to this church in Corinth, who probably had quite a lot of farming community, he's saying to them, you have seen 1,000,000 times. You've seen 1,000,000 times that you put something like an apple or a grain of wheat into the ground and it has to die before something comes to life. And he's saying, how can you possibly doubt that God can take a dying body and bring life of it? You've seen it 1,000 times. Is it reasonable to doubt that God can do that? No, it's not. That's what he's saying there in that verse. And then he carries on and he tells us all about these different kinds of things. He basically just lists a whole load of things, doesn't he? Okay, step back a second. Imagine you've never seen an apple. Imagine you've never seen an apple tree. If I were to cut this up and give you one of the seeds and to ask you what the apple tree would look like, would you be able to tell me? No, you wouldn't, would you? And anything that you try to imagine might be a bit fanciful. And you can kind of imagine these people are saying, what do you think these resurrection bodies are going to look like? You know, isn't that daft? Isn't that a bit fanciful? But Paul's response here is he says, look around you. There's so many things and they all have bodies. God has managed to imagine and create millions and millions and billions of things around you that have bodies. Is it really sensible to doubt that he can create one more just because we haven't seen it? Is it really sensible to doubt that God has the power to come up with a resurrection body for you just because you've never seen one? It's not, is it? So you can see how Paul very easily deals with these doubts about God's power. And hopefully we understand them just by looking at the apple. If we pick it up then in verse 42, what he then starts doing is he stops so much answering the questions as actually now kind of, instead of defensively answering questions, he's kind of proactively, he's putting forward the wonder of these eternal bodies that we're going to have. And look how he kind of used pairs here. So he says that the body that you've got now is so imperishable, but it's raised imperishable, so it's kind of dying, but it's going to be undying. It's sown in dishonour, so it doesn't, we sometimes feel shame, that's why we wear clothes, right? But it's going to be raised in glory, it's going to be everything it should be. It's sown in weakness, it's going to be raised in power. And so what he's telling us is that yes, we've got these dying bodies now, and that's hard, but we have this amazing eternity to look forward to where there won't be any sickness, there won't be any pain, there'll just be joy. And so it's starting to put to us the wonder of, so just like this apple seed, it might feel a bit unhappy being a rotting apple flesh that's getting eaten by worms and slugs and things. But actually it has becoming a tree, a wonderful tree to look forward to that will last a lot longer than being a seed. But we just need to be a little bit careful with the language that Paul uses here. We can find this a bit confusing because he talks about the natural and the spiritual. And when we read the word natural, when we use natural, we tend to use it in a good sense, don't we? We sort of think, all natural ingredients, that's good, right? Naturally talented, that's good as well, isn't it? But actually the best way to understand this, when Paul starts using the word natural, is to actually replace it with the word dying. So we have natural bodies means we have dying bodies. And then when he uses the word spiritual, again, when I hear the word spiritual, I tend to think of something that doesn't have a body. I tend to think of something kind of ethereal. But actually, Paul's not saying that at all. In fact, he's describing in verse 44, he says, raised as a spiritual body. So it does have a body. And actually, the best way to understand that is to replace the word spiritual with undying. Because what Paul is saying here is these spiritual bodies are bodies that properly reflect God. Undying bodies. So when you read through that, that might just help you to understand that. When he said natural, think dying. When he says spiritual, think undying. And then we're going to look at this last section here. So Paul has been kind of contrasting how great the eternal body will be compared to this short-lived dying body that we're in. But then if you carefully look through these verses, he's not actually negative about the body that we're in. He's not actually negative about the dying body. In fact, what he then goes on to say is that this dying body is necessary for the undying body. So you see this in verse 46, he said, the spiritual did not come first, but the natural. So the undying didn't come first, but the dying, and after that, the undying. And he even talks about how Jesus became a life-giving spirit, but he had to become one. Before he was one, he had a body that died. And so Paul is really labouring that just like the seeds need this apple in order to grow into a tree, and that the apple is not a bad thing. It might not represent what the seed has the potential to be, but it's not a bad thing, it's actually a good thing, it's just what the seed needs. But actually our dying bodies are not actually a bad thing, but they're actually just what we need to prepare us for our undying bodies. Okay, so that's apple theology. Okay, that's it. Okay, so hopefully you'll agree that if you understand one of these, then those verses are all right. We'll feel okay about that? Good, again, thumbs up even. That is good interaction. Thank you. Okay, so stop there, but we're not going to, because I think that apple theology has some really fantastic applications, some really apt applications for our life today. And I want to explain three ways that we can really struggle with our bodies, that we can find that there's a tension between who we feel we are on the inside, or who we're meant to be, like the apple seed that's supposed to be a tree, and how we feel, and how we have that tension in how we relate to what we are on the outside in this dying body. Okay? So I talked about one already, actually. I talked about getting old. At the heart of not liking getting old is the fact that we kind of feel that as we get old, our bodies stop properly representing who we are on the inside, don't they? That when, I like to play football, okay, and then will come a point where I can't play football. And so my body won't properly represent the fact that I like to play football. Okay, it won't do that. And so many other ways, and maybe if you're someone maybe in a family where you've got a family member that's affected by dementia, you might be really well aware that actually that person's body no longer really feels like it's representing who that person is. And do you understand, behind this is a tension between who we are on the inside, who we know we've got this potential to be, and how that's represented by our body. Can anybody think of any other ways, particularly maybe in our culture at the moment, that we struggle with our relationship with our bodies? Social media? Yeah, okay, that's a really good one. So social media almost lets us disembody ourselves, doesn't it? It lets us try and be who we are as if we didn't have a body. You don't have to do eye contact if you post something on social media, do you? Any others? Sexuality? Yeah, brilliant. And maybe I can expand that to gender in particular. In a room this size, it's quite likely that there'll be a number of us here who have maybe at some point in our life felt that the gender that we physically are doesn't properly represent who we feel we are on the inside. And there may well be people who are feeling that way right now. So let's explore age. Let's also explore gender. And I want to explore one other, which is, it may not be quite so controversial right now, but I suspect in 10 years' time, it'll be the first one you think of. And it's something called, it's often referred to either as euthanasia or assisted dying. What you call it tends to betray what you think of it. But the idea that you might get to a certain stage in life where perhaps you can't move, or you're in constant pain, and actually you would like a doctor to help you end your life artificially early. Can you see that actually behind all these three things, so aging, gender, and assisted dying, that behind all of those is actually the tension that we feel between who we are on the inside, the potential that we have as a seed to be a tree, and what we are on the outside in our dying bodies. Can you see that? What I really, really like about apple theology is it's going to give us a kind of, almost like a 3-point response. I mean, if you get in a conversation, don't start saying point 1, point 2, point 3, okay? But it kind of actually gives us a 3-stage response. All of those things, and other things too. So the social media thing, I think it's got something to say about as well. I don't have time to talk about them all, so I'm picking those 3. But the first thing that it says, and I think this is really, really helpful to be able to start here, is it actually begins by affirming that pain is real. Some tension that we have for our relationship with our bodies can bring a lot of pain. And this apple theology starts by affirming that pain is real. I'm just going to read some verses written by Poole, a different church in the first century in Rome. This is in Romans chapter 7, verse 21 to 25. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. Can you start to feel this kind of tension and conflict? And then listen to the feeling here, listen to the pain here. What a wretched man I am. And what's the problem? Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. You see what Paul is saying here? He's expressing, maybe in different words than we might use, but he's expressing this tension between who he is on the inside, that tree that he has the potential to become, and how he acts on the outside because of his dying body. And then later on in that same letter, he actually extends this to the whole of creation. It's not just Paul who's felt this way, it's the whole of creation. I consider that our present sufferings, this is Romans 8, 18 to 21, if you're a note taker, are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. But the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, picking up that conflict there, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. Pick up the relationship with its body there, and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. So that's another bit that can be quite hard to follow in Paul's letters, but basically I hope you picked up that the whole creation is aware of this tension and frustration and kind of ill-at-easeness and pain in who we are on the inside and how our bodies represent us. And then finally, I want to go back to Genesis 3. The man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And this was just after they had taken a bite from the fruit. It probably wasn't an apple, but they'd taken a bite from the fruit. It was the first ever sin. And they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I'd sinned? No. Because I was naked. So I hid." See, even for the very first man and woman, when sin entered into the world, the first thing we were aware of was that our bodies didn't represent who we were supposed to be. We were meant to be created in God's glory. And Adam and Eve were aware and ashamed not of their sin instinctively, but of their bodies. And so actually the wonderful thing about apple theology is that, and I know pigs, they can't talk, right? But can you imagine, okay, if the pig could talk to me, it's a couple of months in and it's kind of sat still inside this rotting, decaying, horrible apple with wood lice and a bit of mould and it's kind of gone a bit gooey. The pig is going to be saying, "This isn't right. This isn't what I'm going to be. I'm supposed to be this tree." And the wonderful thing about apple theology, and more importantly the Bible, is that actually it says that pain is real. Paul has felt it. Creation has felt it. Every person that's ever lived has felt it at a time in our life that our bodies and our inner being are misaligned. There's a conflict and it causes pain. And that's a wonderful place to be able to start to say to people that God understands your pain. He understands that it's real. And because it's real, there must be a solution. And this brings us to our next step, okay? The next thing is that we can lovingly try and correct some of the solutions that are given. Okay? Now, you might get stopped at this point, but apple theology gives us a chance to try and lovingly correct some of the solutions that are given. So, you get to your next birthday, you start to feel old, you maybe see some new wrinkles or some grey hairs or whatever. What is it you do? You go and buy anti-aging cream. Or, the best thing, you go on a detox. Okay, and we will fight aging, won't we? We will win. We won't get old, will we? We'll win. And of course, it doesn't like us. But supposing you feel you're one gender on the inside and you feel you're another on the outside, what's the solution that's often offered? It's to take hormone suppressants or to have your body surgically altered. If you're in pain and you want to end this life, the solution that's being proposed is that we have our bodies healed artificially early. Those are the solutions that are being offered. Now just imagine that this apple pip that can talk has told us about its pains of being in this rotting, decaying apple when it knows it should be a tree. And imagine if I listen to that pip and I say, "I feel your pain. I feel your pain. This must be awful. I've got an apple tree in my garden. I'm going to go drill a little hole in the apple tree and I'm going to put you in the apple tree." Is that what the pip means? That's not what the pip means, is it? As painful as it is, this apple, this body, this dying body, is the thing that we need to prepare us for the undying body. It's actually the very thing that we most need. And to change our bodies is not the solution. Lovingly, changing our bodies is not the solution. The pain is real, and there has to be a solution. which is trying to change our bodies, isn't it? And then finally, it lets us come on to Jesus as the real solution. Okay, so what I haven't really talked about is that actually there's two eternal bodies. So we all have this short-lived body that is dying, and we'll all be raised again. But some of us will go to what we normally call heaven. It's a paradise where there's no pain, there's just eternal joy with God forever. Well, actually others will go to the opposite. They'll go to a place called hell, where there's only pain, there's no joy, it's being away from God forever. And there's one way to get there, and it's not by being good enough, it's simply by asking Jesus to forgive us for our sins and putting our trust in him. And the way this kind of pans out in apple theology, okay, is if I open this up and I found an apple seed, but I also found a lemon seed, okay, I don't know how that's got there. If I go and plant my apple seed and my lemon seed, do I get two apple trees? No, I get a lemon tree and an apple tree, right? And what apple theology says is that actually it's what's on the inside that matters. That's not controversial, is it? The whole world around us knows it's what's on the inside that matters. And I wish that apple theology could say that those pains, that conflict that we have with our body would just be done away with right now. It doesn't. The reality is that we do have this short life in a dying body that might involve quite a lot of suffering. And apple theology doesn't tell us that God's just going to do away with it now. He does tell us that if we trust in Jesus, it will all be done away with one day. But the thing that I can tell you is that suffering now is not for nothing. I don't claim to explain why we suffer, but I do know that the struggles that we have with who we feel we are on the inside, who we have the potential to be, and with our dying bodies, are not for nothing. They are to prepare us for an eternal joy with God. And if you want that, the way that you get that is by trusting and following Jesus. Asking him for forgiveness, asking for him to be your Lord. I'm just going to finish with one final thought. It's really not my own original thought, so don't say, wow, Gez, that's profound. I think it is quite profound, but it's not for me. If you are a follower of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus, then this life now, with all its pains, with all its joys, and in this dying body, it is the closest thing you will ever experience to hell. If you are not a follower of Jesus, then this life, with many of the same pains, many of the same joys, with a dying body, is the closest thing you will ever experience to heaven or paradise.